Hello, everyone. Welcome back to Not Safe for Wonks. We have a very exciting episode today. I'm Kennedy Cooper. And, we've talked a lot about making progress within our government, getting out bad reps who don't really support the mainline values of the people, or especially the Democratic Party, and getting in good people. We've talked a lot about the Justice Democrats, but one group we've talked about a bit less is brand new Congress. And excitingly, we have a brand new Congress candidate here today with us to talk about his campaign, brand new Congress, and trying to change the system and make something that works for more people. And that is Shaniyat Chowdhury. Welcome to the show.
Yeah, thanks for having me. I really appreciate it. I love doing these podcasts. It really gives me good opportunities to get to know more folks outside of your usual establishment media. So this is
That's kind of what we've been trying to do with this podcast, is reach out to people that aren't really heard by the typical media figures and give them a voice in politics. And thanks for coming on.
Yeah, man, appreciate it. Let's get this going.
Absolutely. So, Shan, why don't you start off by just introducing yourself a little bit and talking about how you came to be a candidate for New York's 5th Congressional District?
Yeah, for sure. So my friends just call me Sean for sure, and I live in Southside Jamaica, Queens. I live in public housing. And growing up, I've been living in working class neighborhoods my whole life, and I moved around a lot growing up as a kid, and I got to really see the perspectives of just like being poor. And I come from an immigrant family. Both my parents immigrated from Bangladesh, and they strive for this American dream. So they saved up enough money to buy this nice suburban home. Being the only brown family there, we got to really see the privileges of like some people have. We ended up losing our home in the 2007, like in the early beginnings of the financial crisis, so the Great Recession, and we lost our home. And that's when we kind of were just like traumatized by the system itself. And my parents kind of just lost hope after that. As being the eldest of three from an immigrant family, there's always like this unwritten code of having the responsibility to provide for my family, to help make ends meet. So shortly after high school, actually ended up joining the Marine Corps, not out of like being an American, but just because out of survival, getting an opportunity for education, healthcare, all that. And it wasn't until I came back, I realized nothing had changed. A lot of my friends were still stuck where they were. Some went to jail, some, died because of poverty, and I realized there's something really wrong with the system. So I guess just over time, I ended up just shortly after graduating from John Jay College in sociology, I ended up working in the New York State Assembly, focusing on policies around criminal justice reform, housing rights, and climate change. And then I ended up getting on Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez's campaign, and I worked on her campaign as her staffer. So I worked with her really close. Got to see the ins and out of what it's like being a candidate every day. So I saw the challenges, and I kind of questioned, like, is this something I could maybe do one day? So I had it in the back of my head. And then when I went down to Tijuana back in December, actually almost a year ago, went down to organize with a bunch of other folks to help the asylum seekers who are stuck at the border. And, that's when it kind of really hit me. We spoke with a lot of families, heard the stories of, how and, why they were escaping their poverty and government persecution from Central America. When you hear these stories about how mothers and children are coming up to the border, it should tell you that they have nowhere else to go. And my opponent, Gregory Meeks, him being on the Committee for Foreign Affairs, this is something I went to him about to address. And New York 5 has 7% of immigrants. We've had many ICE raids happening, and I'm like, hey, listen, you're on the Committee for Foreign Affairs. Can you have a stronger stance on immigration at least? And because the Trump administration is doing everything they can to ensure that immigrants aren't able to come here to escape whatever they're escaping from. So he was just saying how we just need to create more bed space in these detention centers. And to hear that was just really disheartening. When I was telling him, like, we need to make sure that we expedite these asylum cases. We make sure that their human rights weren't violated, make sure that they had proper medical treatment. He did not address any of those points, and he just left it at that. So that kind of did it for me. And then, with the housing crisis, actually, again, going back to my family losing our home in 2007, we're kind of reliving what's going on almost 10 years later now of the housing crisis. Our market is not as strong as people think. New York 5 has some of the highest rates of home foreclosures in the country, and it's something that we need to battle. I think that it's more than challenging an incumbent. It's about dismantling an oppressive system. But in order to do that, we need to challenge those who enable it.
Of course, yeah.
So you talked about housing and living through the housing crisis. I definitely lived through that, and Kennedy lived through that, and both of us were basically of age when that hit in 2007. Can you talk about like your personal experiences of how that hit you, and was it out of nowhere? Were you politically aware at the time, and like how did it affect you and your family?
Yeah, for sure. I think I was only about 13. I was like a freshman in high school at the time, so I was just your average kid, honestly. I was never involved into like politics. My dad growing up was a socialist, but for me, like I just wasn't ever interested in like politics or government. But both my parents were part of the labor movement. They were both members of Local 54 100, which are casino workers labor organization. So I started noticing my dad would just come home, started telling me like, man, out of nowhere. And we were living in South Jersey at the time, so both my parents were working in Atlantic City. My father was working at casinos that Trump did own. So we just started hearing stories like, man, families are starting to get laid off from work. And he was just kind of concerned that he would be next. And so he started taking me out to these rallies where like we're protesting and we're screaming with thousands of other families trying to like protect our livelihood. So I realized, man, this is just not my family being impacted by this, but it's others. And these are like close family friends who are on the brink of losing their jobs and their homes. My parents couldn't afford to keep, to pay the mortgage off for the home. Seeing all that, then my dad got laid off. Then he got sick from Lyme disease. So my mother, she started picking up extra shifts, just working at a Sheraton hotel, just like as a hotel maid. Seeing all that really was just like disheartening, and I just wasn't really sure what was gonna happen to us at the time. And then unfortunately, I got my first job like on the weekends, just working at a flea market. So I was like making like $5 an hour, providing whatever I can to like make sure we're able to pay off our bills.
Right, just trying to help.
Yeah, but it wasn't enough. So we had family from New York come to us, and they try to help however way they can. And I think they saw that there was really no good outcome to the situation because our neighbors lost their home. We saw foreclosed signs down the block, and we knew it was going to happen to us. And then after both my parents lost their jobs, we realized that the only option was to just move back to New York and start fresh. And then when we did move back, my parents just kind of like got away from the movement. They kind of just want to stay, stay quiet and just try to live a normal life. So they were kind of traumatized by it. And then that's when I started becoming more socially conscious and aware of like just how our politics, government really impact us.
Sure. So I'm very curious. We've talked with other interview guests and also amongst ourselves about kind of like hearing about progressive ideas or about hearing about socialism for the first time. And I have to say, I'm very fascinated by you saying that your dad was a socialist. And I'm kind of curious, first of all, what you mean by that. If he was like an old school, had read Marx, or if it was came from some other kind of background or something.
Yeah.
I mean, this cycle we've had a lot of socialist parents, like both Kamala and Buttigieg have had them, and they've kind of distanced themselves from their children. So, but yeah. So, what does your dad's kind of politics have an influence on you?
Yeah. So my parents are from Bangladesh, and it's a really, really young country. They only got their independence in 1971. So, a spark from the liberation movement was this huge communist and socialist movement that was going on over there. And a lot of it was inspired by Maoism. And my father actually started his own socialist political club at his university in Bangladesh. And they threatened to kick him out if he didn't close it down.
Dang.
Yeah.
That's the real shit right there.
Yeah, that's some real shit. Yeah. So
that's great.
my father, he was pretty even to this day, like he's not as socialist today. I think he's kind of, as he's gotten older, he's became a little bit more senile. But he's really excited by Bernie, and then just really motivated to get back into it after now that I'm running now. So he's kind of feel like this is like his lifelong prophecy for him.
So he's very excited about your campaign and supports you.
Yeah,
that's amazing.
That's wonderful.
That's like the best story anyone could tell, practically, right there. Just like something like that with that kind of just a family touch. It's just beautiful to see, really. Like you don't see enough of that in positive, progressive politics.
Yeah, it's odd because growing up, my father and I really didn't have a close relationship, actually. A lot of the times, I feel like he was just absent in like a lot of my activities and just my social life. It wasn't really until this where he was like, I want to get involved. I'm like, wow, Dad. Like, it's only been 27 years. But
that's really sweet.
Yeah.
That's really cool.
Yeah.
Let's get back into more specific politics.
For sure.
Especially in regards to housing, because I feel like this is a very big issue. We already kind of touched on just how big 2007, 2008, the recession and the housing market crash was a little bit. But I'm curious from your perspective, what are some of the ways that we could prevent something like that from happening again, and that you specifically would prevent something like that from happening again?
Yeah, for sure. I look at it in a threefold. So the one thing we need to do is break up the big banks. I think we need to break up big banks and support more community banks. Not one big financial institution should have all the power in the world, all the money in the world, to the point where we're on the brink of another economic crisis. So, I think that with community banks, they're the ones who are owned by the community. They invest into the community to make sure that they create jobs and that they make sure that people from the community can buy homes. And then also, I think the Dodd-Frank itself, I don't think it's the greatest of solution. I think it's a moderate solution point where it's enough where we could stop the loopholes from moderate Democrats, Republicans to really pull it apart. My opponent, Gregory Meeks, actually, he supports this Madden Fix bill. So the Madden Fix bill, what it does is that it gives the big banks and payday lenders the power and the ability to impose unlimited amounts of interest rates on families who need loans. Mind you, most working families are already in debt. So, not only are they not able to pay off their mortgage loans, but also medical, so we're talking about education, medical, all these other necessities that they're already in debt for. And the fact that big, powerful institutions have the ability to really prey on working families, I just think that's morally wrong. And then I look into the federal homes guarantee. So the federal homes guarantee it starts to really come into light by a lot of representatives, by Ilhan Omar, Ayanna Pressley, AOC herself. And we're looking to create more than 12 million new public housing for working families and impacted communities. And with that comes with addressing racist policies like redlining and, making sure that we take away these predatory practices like payday lending. It comes with reparations from impacted communities who are predominantly are people of color. And then lastly, making sure that we transition our public housing into the new Green New Deal economy. And then lastly, public housing. Myself, I live in public housing in South Jamaica, Queens. A lot of people who live in public housing are kind of like just thrown to the sidelines or forgotten about, and like resources that we need. And, we want to make sure that RAD doesn't happen. Gregory Meeks, he's a big proponent of privatizing public housing. I think that we need ownership. I think the tenants themselves need to have ownership of where they live. And when you have ownership of where you live, you can invest into it. So one, I think tenants who live in public housing should be able to own it. Section 3 of the HUD Act actually does say that people who live in public housing should have jobs in public housing. And a lot of that does not happen. A lot of the jobs like repairments, these are being outsourced to private contractors. So I think that when you create a federal jobs program for free for public housing tenants. We're given the opportunity to obtain trade skills to where they could actually get jobs within public housing, unionize, and work where they live, because no one else, again, is going to have better investment than the people that live here.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. Makes a lot of sense. I think that's a very good point.
Yeah.
So
Speaking
just
of
to kind of
investments.
clarify. Oh, go ahead, Brandon.
No, I mean, if you'd like to go ahead, I can. But
No,
I mean,
it's fine.
Speaking of investments, gotta say, Greg Meeks has gotten sizable investments from people who I think make the kind of policies that you've been talking about basically impossible. I mean, Queens is kind of in the shadow of Wall Street. I guess the entire state of New York is when it comes to donations and things like that. What is your feeling on, can someone be an honest actor while taking money from Wall Street, or do you think it's a corrupting influence, or is it something in between?
Oh, absolutely not. It's blatantly obvious that when you know where an elected official is, you know where they're taking money from. They are going to be representing not the constituents but the people on Wall Street. It's blatantly obvious. He's made it publicly known that he doesn't really care about. Literally, there is a constituent who I've spoken with. She's mentioned how he's told her that at an event that he doesn't really care about doing any kind of grassroots organizing or work with the people, the constituents, because they're not giving him the votes, they're not giving him the money. These are like everyday people that he's not really talking to. And the people that do give him money are the people who are, are in his pocket and he's doing their bidding. And we can even look at a recent example, Comcast. So Comcast, there's an issue right now with the Supreme Court, actually. They just had a hearing recently, Comcast versus Byron Hill. And Comcast paid $2,000. They paid $2,000 every cycle to Gregory Meeks. And we know that the max donation is $2,800. So in that perspective, that's a lot of money for donation. Byron Allen, he's suing Comcast for racial discrimination because they wouldn't agree to a contract to allow his network to be broadcasted on Comcast. So he's claiming racial discrimination under the Civil Rights Act of 1886. Only very few members of the Congressional Black Caucus came out in support of him. Very few. And the one member, and if you see the members who did not come out in support, they were taking money from Comcast. One of them was Gregory Meeks. So I think that should tell you a story that where their moral obligations are when it comes to civil rights movement, and social justice rights, and then compared to where they're taking money from. And they'll be, they'll still be silent when, be brave about a certain issue, they're going to stay silent. So I think that says enough.
Definitely. Now, to sort of pivot to a different issue, one of the things on your issues page is that you call for abolition of ICE, and that's something that's sort of become a progressive rallying cry at the inhumanity of Trump's sort of detention of undocumented migrants. Now, some have gone some have gone varying degrees farther, calling for the abolition of the Department of Homeland Security, Customs and Border Protection, and even like candidates like Joshua Collins calling for the abolition of the CIA. So I'm just curious as to where you stand on those issues, and sort of what would you ideally, what would you want to abolish and what would you not? How far do you go?
Yeah, for sure. Yeah, I mean, I think we need to go as far as possible to ensure that human rights are protected. Living in a police state is not the way to go. Me, myself as a candidate, I'm like always learning about, how we could really navigate in this society. So, I'm going as far as like abolishing, Custom Borders Patrol, and I think we should have open borders. It's definitely worked with the New York model in Europe. I don't see, we've had open borders before where, people were able to really, cross.
I mean, in the early 1800s, the time between an immigrant arriving in the U.S. and becoming a citizen was like 3 weeks.
Right. Like there weren't a lot of, really challenges to really come here. I don't see how.
And even as it got harder, it wasn't actually criminalized until like the 90s.
Right, and
So,
we made it harder. We
yeah.
made it harder with the drug wars. We made it
Oh, yeah.
harder by colonizing and imperializing Central South America. So we know that when Republicans especially talk about immigrants coming here, raping our children, our women and children, and being criminals, we know that these are all fear-mongering tactics. Nothing about this has anything to do with what they're talking about, because they haven't even been down there. They send our military down there to overthrow their governments, to kill the people, and I think that it's our fault for the instability that these nations have. So I think we need to readdress everything that's going on down there. We need to also pull off the sanctions on Venezuela. So we have a lot to really address, and a lot of it is our fault. And I think it's time that the U.S. Holds ourselves accountable for the things we've done.
Yeah, absolutely.
I think it's funny that you mentioned like the not even having been there thing, because not only have they not been to a lot of these countries that they're pilfering in any significant capacity, but they also haven't spent enough time even in the border states. I live in one of the border states, and anybody who lives in a border state can tell you none of us want this crap. Like, we're all really tired of this already. We have ICE everywhere. You can't go anywhere near the border without dealing with ICE agents, and it's a huge pain in the ass. Nobody likes it. And again, the people that are making these decisions, they don't come down here. They don't talk to us. They talk to some guy in Alabama who's like, I'm worried about immigrants.
I was watching this video the other day about a Canadian border town that, because of they fucked up when drawing the border, and the U.S.-Mexico border, or the U.S.-Canada border in this town goes directly across a street. And like a few decades ago, it was perfectly accepted for like the American residents to head over to the Canadian side and back, and relations were friendly and everything was fine. But now, like post 9/11, they've locked that shit down. Like, there's CCTV cameras, and if you even like look like you're about to cross the road and go into the other country, like they have ICE agents and CBP agents fucking on you. And this is just for Canada, our safe, and by safe I mean white neighbor.
I think Shan already put it best when he said that, a police state is not the way to go.
Absolutely.
I mean, we're kind of forgetting that what we don't realize is that most people that immigrate here don't really want to leave their homes, but because of the certain circumstances that they have, the poverty and how the government has been overthrown, it's not safe where they are, So of course a lot of people are gonna come here because we have, as being one of the richest nations in the world, like we have the capacity to bring in people and actually take care of them. We have that capacity, and I think it's just wrong that are making people suffer because of our wrongdoings.
If you believe that there were human rights abuses at the border, do you think that the people who ordered or implemented those abuses should be prosecuted? And if so, to what degree?
So here's the thing about prosecution, and I'm trying to figure this out, because I'm all for abolishing prisons too.
That's exactly what I was going to ask you. So, yeah. How do you square that circle then personally?
Yeah, I mean, it's definitely a conflict that I have internally, because, I think that if police spend as much time, collaring white collar criminals compared to, working poor people, then we'd see a lot more investment into our communities, because rich people they tend to get away with everything. But at the same time, I don't want to keep enabling a system that's already done harm to generations, especially to the most marginalized people. And I think if we continue to uphold the system, we're going to see that system's continue going to be enabled. So, I mean, how do we hold these people accountable is something I'm trying to really, really figure out. But I think on a larger scale, I think the U.S. definitely has the budget where there's money, we definitely have the money and the priorities to shift it to where we need to reparate indigenous lands, indigenous people, African American inheritance. I think these are things we need to address, and that's one big way of holding anybody who's had money and power accountable.
So, kind of building on that, when you say prison abolition, this is another sort of progressive watchword that's become a slogan lately, and it means a lot of different things to a lot of different people. So, I'm just going to give you some space here. What does prison abolition mean to you?
Yeah, so prison abolition to me means like to not really have the police state and not being surveillanced by by the government who has no investment but to throw you into these cages and just to make profit off of it. And I think again that's just wrong. Most people that go in and out of prison tend to go back within the next 3 years because they come out with no foundation, no resources for education or job opportunities or mental health. And we're put them in these situations. We see that the prison industrial complex is not correctional. It's a cyclical system, and only it's just made to make profits off of poor working Black and brown people. It's just wrong.
I think that's a great answer. But could you get even just a little bit more specific? Because I think a lot of times when you bring up prison abolition on the street, to just like, average voter, they tend to immediately jump to some sort of shocking images in their mind. I mean, like the Purge movies, maybe,
something like that.
And maybe you could kind of get into just a little bit deeper, because I know that this is a core issue on your site, and you do have some deeper thoughts.
If I do something, what happens to me?
and what things actually require something to happen, maybe even.
Right. So, I mean, most people who do get caught up in criminal-like behavior and activity are the same people who tend to get caught up, who are actually victims of like past trauma, or any kind of poverty. There's a huge correlation between crime and poverty and traumatization and crime. So I think we need to really address the core issues of these by ensuring that, people who do get caught up, we don't want to prosecute people. I don't think that's the way to go, but we should provide them a space and opportunity to make sure that they are given the resources needed. So that way, when they do come back, make sure that they are in a stable and safe foundation to make sure they stay away from any kind of criminal activity to begin with.
So just kind of a fundamental move of the model of criminal justice from punitive to rehabilitative justice.
Correct. And, we've seen it does work in Europe, and I don't see why it can't work here. Like, it could definitely work. We just need to change the way, we really approach just how we treat individuals in general. I think if we constantly look at individuals as criminals, we're going to continue to treat them as criminals. So we need to really start changing this mindset. And I think that could really turn the tables with, as we progress into the next 4 or 8 years. I think that we could definitely see a change, prison abolition.
Let's talk a little bit more about changing the mindset, because I think that there's like kind of a serious and very deeply steeped into American culture problem with sort of paranoia for the neighbor, paranoia for the stranger.
Yeah.
You walk to the grocery store and you see the guy who looks a little sketchy, and a lot of people's minds are immediately like, maybe he's a murderer, maybe he's a rapist. In reality, maybe he's nothing. Maybe he's a harmless drug addict just trying to get through his day.
Yeah.
Maybe he's a petty thief who has committed some crimes in the past, but is trying to do better now and deserves some kind of,
Maybe he didn't do shit. Maybe he didn't do shit and he just came from his job and he's fucking tired.
Right. Yeah. He just got off a construction job. So how do you overcome that sort of like basic paranoia that I think is so endemic to so much of American society?
Yeah. I mean, again, I think where there's money is priorities. And we see that whenever you walk into a more affluent, rich, white neighborhood, people have opportunities, people have jobs, people have the great schools in the neighborhoods. And when you have that kind of foundation stability, yes, more likely than not, you're going to live, you're not going to get caught up in criminal behavior. So why do working poor, working class, poor neighborhoods do not have these resources? So we need to ask these questions, because we don't ask these questions when we're getting tax cuts for the rich. We don't ask these questions when we're funding, these endless wars. But whenever it comes to making sure we need money for our schools in poor working class neighborhoods, there's always a question about how much money we can give. Or when there's ever a question about how we can save these mom and pop shops, and and then put like these big corporations in place. There's always questions, always doubt, whenever it's anything beneficial for working poor families. So
Yeah.
I think as long as we treat
Mhm.
black and brown people the same way as rich, affluent white people, then I think we start seeing changes. So we need to the money is there, and I don't want to really hear like the BS excuses. Oh, how are we going to pay for it? It's utter bullshit. The money
Yeah.
is there. At
Yeah.
state and federal level, the money is there.
Yeah, definitely.
It's very true. And I think that's a great point about, that when somebody says, oh, we need to hire 600 more police officers in our city, no one says, well, how are we going to pay for it?
Yeah, so actually, yeah, New York City actually most recently they just hired like 300 new cops on, I think 3,000, something like that. It's some assurance like big number, and these cops have been like arresting poor people who are just selling food for like $2. Like these are just like your desserts, your to go food for $2, and because they can't afford to have a license, they're still selling it for $2. The cops ended up arresting them anyways. So it's like,
Yeah.
though, if you could pay money to get new cops into the subways, there's definitely money to make sure that immigrants have licenses that they need so they can make a living.
I mean, I think the exact number was they were spending $250 million to hire cops to beat fare evasion, which was losing them a projected
Yeah.
$200 million a year.
Yeah, mind you, these CEOs on the board, they continue to get pay raises every year while our fare hikes are increasing. So I think they need a cut in their paycheck. Maybe that could fix something.
Yeah, maybe.
Maybe if these public services actually work for the public.
Maybe we
Yeah.
could cut their
Yeah.
pay and make the whole thing free and without fares. Just kidding, unless.
Yeah.
Some of what you've touched on kind of breaks out of the local and a little bit into foreign policy.
I think that
Yeah.
strain of paranoia also affects who we go to war with and when and how long it takes. I definitely think we're kind of lucky because our generation is pretty exhausted with military adventures. And I mean, Leia, I think we've been at war since she was born or pretty close to it. I know that you personally support repealing the AUMF. And for people who don't
Yes.
know, this is basically, I'm slightly oversimplifying. It's basically a declaration from Congress that the president can do whatever he wants as long as it's under the banner of the war on terror. And I know that Mattis and Tillerson and a few other people have argued that since the war on terror is always changing and name brands are shifting and things like that, this banner is still very useful because otherwise you have to come back and get a new authorization for every individual group that's under this banner of this war. What do you think about that? And do you think that Congress is just kind of refusing to take responsibility for this stuff?
I mean, to begin with that, Congress should we're talking about having democratic process. We don't live in an authoritarian state, so yeah, no one person should have the right and decision making power, something to that capacity to really go into war. We've seen that it has devastated us for generations. When we went into Iraq, we went to Afghanistan, and these are pointless wars, and we've lost millions of lives. Not just our armed forces, but innocent civilians in other nations lost their lives because of an unjust war that was made for profits. We know these wars are made for profits. We have lost these wars have cost us over $5.6 trillion. That, again, all that money could have been used for our resources here. So it's absurd that any one person should have the authority to make this is like a life and death situation decision. This is a decision not just over one life. We're talking about millions of lives. So why is only that one person can make that kind of decision? I think that that's how it was beforehand. Congress had the ability to discuss these procedures in the House, and I think that's what we need to get back to.
I think part of it is like there are people still getting dragged over the coals for their vote on the Iraq War, and there aren't many votes to get dragged over the coals about now. So it's almost like a way to not be responsible if something goes wrong. Because you're talking about like the responsibility for those decisions, but there's also like blame to go around when a decision doesn't go well.
We can't undermine the American voters, because if they see that if Congress members don't want to take accountability and they don't want to take responsibility for what the president is doing, then I guarantee you within the next 2 years, every 2 years, these voters will put in somebody to represent them who will stand up to a president who's obviously not capable of leading a nation.
You've mentioned on your website that you want to reduce aid to countries that are committing human rights violations. There are a lot of countries that we have sensitive relationships with that are committing human rights violations. So I don't feel like I'm super putting you on the spot because you probably know 4 or 5 of these countries. Turkey, do you consider them human rights violators?
Yes.
Saudi Arabia.
Yes.
Israel.
Yes.
China,
yes.
Are you worried about like this causing a lot of diplomatic pressure, or do you think this will improve their behavior or isolate them, or what? Or is it more about us and cleaning the moral scale? What do you see as the goal of lowering our investment in those countries? Like to what end?
Yeah, I think it's a combination, a little bit of all that. We have the United Nations, we have the Universal Human Rights Declaration for a purpose, for a reason, because we've seen that dictators and governments have been able to get away with killing their peoples without being held accountable. And no one's really speaking up for the Muslims in China. No one's really speaking up for the Palestinians. So someone has to really stand up. And I think that the U.S. being a leader in the United Nations, we could absolutely come together with other nations to hold other nations accountable for what they're doing. It's just utterly wrong. Palestinians should absolutely have the same rights as Israelis. Like I'm not going to say I'm anti-Israel. I think that Israelis should have equal rights as Palestinians and vice versa.
While we're brushing on the topic of Israel-Palestine, do you support a 2-state solution or something else?
I keep going back and forth on this one, to be honest. This is something I'm still trying to figure out. I think that at the end of the day, that's something the Palestinian people would have to figure out what they want. I don't think it's in the best interest or best really responsibility of the U.S. or any other nation to make that kind of decision. But I absolutely do think that they have the right to have free, equal, and equitable rights. But again, I think I go back and forth on it. Some days I'm like, yeah, fuck yeah, they should have a 1-state solution. And other times I'm like, I don't know. Maybe a 2-state solution would be best. I don't know. It's something that it is a complicated situation, and it's something I'm continuously learning about. But I honestly do believe that Palestinians should have right, and I do support the BDS movement. That's another thing I do support because that's something that should be protected by the First Amendment.
Absolutely. So, Shan, I think it's interesting having this conversation and some of the other political conversations we've had with interview guests as well. We've touched on a lot of topics today that basically would have been taboo for a candidate to talk about 10 years ago. And I'm kind of curious to hear about from you. You're part of this brand new Congress movement, so you're really getting to see a lot of, not just from your perspective of your campaign, but like how this movement is shaping up on a national scale. What do you think is changing, and how far do you think that this change is going to go? because some people kind of have this belief that, we're kind of on this infinite path to the left now, and other people think the opposite, that, yes, we're going to make some changes, but ultimately there will be pushback and we won't go very far.
I mean, change has always been slow and always will be, but I think what we're starting to see the shift of, I think, just everyday people really being able to find the courage to stand up and say that they will not stand up and just wait around for what's going on, because what's great about Brand New Congress is that I'm connecting with candidates across the country who have different experiences, different work experience, lived experiences, and we all have one thing in common, and that's that our destinies are intertwined. We're all fighting the same master at the end of the day. We're all fighting the same systematic oppression, and that we need that. The only way we could ever make change is that if we just participate on a huge massive scale. We've seen that it could happen. With 2018, we've seen that someone like Bernie, who's giving another shot, we know that we're getting there. We just need more people to stand up and find the inspiration and to be positive about it. It does take a lot of work, and I don't think it's going to end. I think as long as we keep getting this momentum going, we are going to see it shift, and where, regardless of party affiliation, like I was an independent. When Bernie ran, I couldn't vote for him in the primary in 2016, but I changed to a Democrat, and I think that as long as your convictions are just about fighting for the working people, fighting up for indigenous Black people, I think that when you fight for what is right, people are gonna really feel that. They're gonna feel inspired by that, and I think that more people will just stand up and run for office. Honestly, that's what's gonna happen. We're going to see more people with different experiences who haven't even ran for office before, or who haven't had previous elected official office experience before. They're going to be running for these positions because they know that their voice and their courage is going to speak to the millions who don't have the voice to stand up.
Yeah.
So obviously, I think one of the reasons that you are so inspired when you talk about this stuff is because you were a part of, as you touched on at the very beginning of this interview, one of the most inspirational progressive campaigns of recent times, or perhaps ever in American history, which is, of course, I'm talking about Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez. I'm really curious about one thing in particular. Did you kind of feel the magic of that campaign right away, or was it sort of like at the start, was it more of a let's do this and see what happens? Like, I'm just kind of curious if it had a sense of purpose and destiny from the beginning, or if it was something that sort of came together.
I'm someone who's very optimistic, so I tend to manifest all this positive energy into people that I believe in personally. So when I first heard about her, actually, one of my best friends actually worked with her at the restaurant she was working at previously before she ran for office. And this is very early on, and she had mentioned, hey, my coworker is thinking about running for Congress. You may want to, maybe help her out. And at the time, that's when I started getting into politics a little. So I just kept it in the back of my head. And then months later down the road, I see her TYT interview, and I'm like, wow, this person is really talking the talk, and I just believe it. I could tell that she was genuine and that she really meant what she was trying to fight for. So I just volunteered right away, and I was interning at the time. I was interning at a law firm that's just as a record clerk, and I would leave work early just to go knock on doors, just to call folks and let them know about the election. And you could tell the energy on the streets was different when you talk to each person door to door. When you see the events that she's at, her energy, her demeanor just said that she was gonna literally knock down the house. Just like her documentary, she's gonna knock down the house. And I just felt like she was gonna win. There were a lot of people. Obviously, she was the underdog. She didn't have the money. She didn't have the name recognition at the time. And so there was a lot of doubters. Even she could. I can't speak for her, but she could maybe say that she even had she even had some doubt winning. And I think a lot of people on the team did. But I was sold from the get-go that she was going to win just by door knocking alone. Something, and that's like the grassroots work itself. You're going door to door. You see that no one has ever heard of Joe Crowley. You see that a lot of people even like Joe Crowley. Him being the fourth most powerful Democrat in the House. What has that meant to people of New York 14? Nothing. It just meant that he's been able to take in millions of dollars from real estate developers who've come in and displaced working people from New York 14. And that's what we're seeing in other districts throughout the country, including New York. So, yeah, absolutely. She inspired me because she was just a regular person running for office. And she just had the courage of standing up and, to fight for what was right.
All right, Shaniyat Chowdhury, what do you need to knock down the House?
I need money. Someone who's running a grassroots campaign, we're taking only public donations. So that means from friends, family, neighbors, or, your friends, whoever. We need every dollar to really go against this machine because, for one, my opponent is taking money from the finance, insurance industries, real estate industries, and we need to stand up with the power of the people to show that, we have the capacity and the viability to take him on. So if people can donate, that would be so great. $5, $10, $20 would go such a long way. You can visit www.shaniyat2020.com. There's a contribution form there. You can also follow me on Instagram and Twitter at Shaniyat2020. Just spread the message out. Whatever help we can get from the public. This is what it's all about. It's just really come together to really make a social generational change.
Well, you heard them, folks. Give us those websites and the Twitter one more time, just for everybody listening's sake.
www.shaniyat2020.com, and the Instagram and Twitter handles are Shaniyat2020.
That'll be in the show notes. So
Excellent.
Even if you're
for people who probably can't spell that out.
Right. it's just you click it, you go.
It's great. It's great.
Yeah.
But it's been.
But we do like to make sure we have a very engaged audience, and part of what we're trying to do is build a larger progressive network, because if only people in Queens, in New York's 5th district know about your candidacy, it's not as likely to take off. And of course, part of what made Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez's candidacy so special was its sort of viral quality that captured not just the hearts and minds of the people of her district, but the hearts and minds of the nation.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I get told a lot, don't worry about going to other communities and talk about your campaign. No one's going to care. But the truth is that people do care because, again, a lot of folks that face situations and hardships in other communities, we face the same things over here. So, they may not be able to vote, but folks are able to come out here and volunteer or even throw dollars to help because we need the backing of the people to get us through. Yeah, exactly. Even my team, one thing I've made a conscious effort is making sure that our team reflected the community. So a lot of people, volunteering unlimited hours on the campaign just because they believe in it are young college kids, actually, believe it or not. A lot of them are these may be the first or second time doing campaign work, but because they have the motivation and the passion to make systemic change, because they know that eventually every decision we make today is going to impact them tomorrow, and that at one point that they'll have the responsibility to make generational change for the next people who are coming up into society.
Well, Shan, you have a fascinating story. You have a very interesting campaign. I'm strongly encouraging all of our audience to give this guy your support. He really deserves it. And it has been a wonderful interview. Thank you so much for coming on the show.
Appreciate it, y'all. You have a good one. Thank you so much.
All right. Thank you, everyone. This has been Not Safe for Wonks. As always, our guest was Shaniyat Chowdhury. I am Kennedy Cooper. Thank you so much for listening, as always. Bye-bye.
See ya.